When you think of 1980s motorcycles, your brain probably goes straight to the icons. You see Maverick on a GPZ 900R, or you picture the razor-sharp edges of the first Suzuki Katana. Those bikes stole the headlines and the posters on our bedroom walls. But while everyone was obsessed with the superbike wars, something else was happening in the background. Engineers were quietly building machines that were too advanced, too weird, or just too early for their time. They were introducing liquid cooling to cruisers, putting turbos on everything, and experimenting with frame geometries that wouldn't become standard for another 20 years. Most of these bikes sat on showroom floors gathering dust while buyers walked right past them to buy the latest race replica. But today, we're digging 17 of them out of the history books. These are the bikes that were actually brilliant, even if nobody noticed back then. We're kicking off this countdown at number 17, with a bike that proves Kawasaki was absolutely unhinged in the mid-80s. This is the Kawasaki 454 LTD. On paper, it looks like just another small cruiser, the kind of thing you'd buy for a beginner. But look closer at that engine. Kawasaki didn't just build a new twin for this bike. They literally took their legendary Ninja 900 engine, the one that changed the world, and chopped it in half. They kept the liquid cooling, they kept the double overhead cams, and they kept the attitude. The result was a 454 cubic centimeters parallel twin putting out a claimed 50 horsepower at the crank. To put that in perspective, a Honda Shadow 500 from the same year was wheezing out significantly less power with zero excitement. The 454 LTD was a baby drag bike. It could embarrass 750 cubic centimeter cruisers from light to light because it revved to the moon. It also featured a belt drive, which was a big deal for maintenance-free riding back then. Sure, the styling is blocky and the seat is weirdly stepped, but that's part of the charm now. You can pick these up dirt cheap to get into 80s ownership, and you're basically getting half a superbike engine in a chassis that's comfortable enough to ride all day. It defied the slow and low stereotype of cruisers before the V-Rod ever existed. Next up at number 16, we have a machine that tried to capitalize on a massive American racing trend but failed because of one tiny fatal flaw. This is the Honda FT500 Ascot. In the early 80s, flat-track racing was huge. Honda wanted to sell a bike that looked like the machines sliding around Ascot Park in California. So they built a 497 cubic centimeters single-cylinder thumper that looked the part. It had the flat seat, the wide bars, and the cast wheels that looked like mags. The brilliance here was the handling. It was light, simple, and narrow. It was essentially a street tracker decades before hipsters made street trackers cool. It made about 33 horsepower, which was plenty for tight canyon roads. But there was a problem. Honda decided to make it electric start only to appeal to new riders. That sounds great, until the starter mechanism, specifically the solenoid-operated starter gear engagement, failed. And it always failed. It made us sound like rocks in a blender, and since there was no kickstart backup, you were stranded. That issue killed the bike's reputation immediately. Today, owners love them for their cornering speed, but if you buy one, you better be ready to fix that starter gear or learn how to bump start it every time. If you're one of the brave souls who owned an Ascot, did you ever actually fix that starter, or did you just get really good at bump starting it? Let me know in the comments if that bike was worth the headache. Moving on to number 15, let's look at Suzuki's attempt to build the perfect commuter, which ended up being an engineering marvel disguised as a boring bike. This is the Suzuki GR650 Tempter. First off, ignore the name. Tempter sounds like a cheap perfume, but the bike itself was fascinating. Suzuki was trying to fight the Yamaha XS650, so they built a 651 cubic centimeters parallel twin. But they didn't just copy the old British designs, they added a full floater rear suspension, which was a mono-shock setup that was way ahead of the twin-shock competition. But the real brilliance was hiding inside the engine. Suzuki used a two-stage flywheel system. At low RPMs, an extra mass was engaged to keep the engine spinning smoothly, giving you that chugging torque feeling of a heavy cruiser. But once you revved it past 3,000 RPM, a centrifugal clutch disengaged that extra weight, allowing the engine to spin up freely like a sport bike. It was genius. It gave you a bike that was impossible to stall in traffic but snappy on the highway. It weighed only 400 pounds dry, making it incredibly flickable. It failed because it looked too conservative for the neon-obsessed 80s, but that two-stage flywheel was a piece of clever engineering that nobody bought. The Tempter proved that clever ideas don't always sell, but it was nothing compared to the high-stakes gambles manufacturers were about to take in the pursuit of the next big thing. At number 14, we arrive at a motorcycle that was arguably the most tragic victim of too much, too soon. This is the Yamaha XZ750, better known in the States as the Vision. In 1982, if you wanted a V-twin, you bought a Cruiser or a Ducati. But Yamaha looked at the V-twin engine architecture and saw the future of sport biking. They were right, of course. The Suzuki SV650 would prove that almost 20 years later, but Yamaha's execution was weirdly complicated. They built a 552 cubic centimeters, liquid-cooled, 70-degree V-twin that revved to a screaming 10,000 RPM. That was unheard of for a V-twin street bike at the time. It made 64 horsepower, which was punching way above its weight class, and they shoved it into a chassis with a shaft drive and a futuristic angular design that looks like a robot from a sci-fi movie. The engineering brilliance was undeniable. The engine was a masterpiece of compact design, using downdraft carburetors nestled in the V of the engine to keep the bike incredibly narrow. It handled beautifully, tipped into corners with just a thought, and had a unique exhaust note that sounded like an angry dirt bike. But those innovative downdraft carburetors were its undoing. They developed a notorious stumble right off idle, a hesitation often traced to the accelerator pump on the Mikuni carbs that became known as the Vision glitch. You'd crack the throttle at a stoplight, the bike would cough, and you'd look like an amateur. Yamaha eventually fixed it, but the reputation was already destroyed. Today, a cult of owners keeps them alive, insisting that once you sort the carbs, it's the best handling middleweight of the decade. Moving to number 13, we have a bike that proves you don't need massive displacement to be brilliant. You just need a belt. This is the Kawasaki GPZ 305. When you hear GPZ, you think of the 550, the 750, or the legendary 900. You think of Top Gun and drag strips. You don't think of this little 306 cubic centimeters air-cooled twin. But in 1983, this was the entry point into that legendary family. And it wasn't just a sticker package. Kawasaki took their utilitarian commuter engine and reworked it with high-compression pistons and bigger valves, squeezing out enough power to actually hit the ton, 100 miles per hour, on a good day. For a 300 cubic centimeter bike in the early 80s, that was serious business. The real brilliance, however, was the drivetrain. Kawasaki fitted it with a Kevlar belt drive. In an era where chains stretched, rusted, and flung grease all over your rear wheel, the belt was a revelation. It was silent, required zero adjustment, and lasted forever. Combined with a 6-speed transmission, another rarity for small bikes, it made the GPZ 305 an ultra-reliable lightweight tourer. It was marketed as a beginner bike, which means most of them were dropped, thrashed, and left to rot in backyards. Finding a clean one today is nearly impossible, but if you do, you'll find a machine that handles on a dime and costs pennies to run. It was the smart choice that nobody wanted to make because it wasn't a big bike. But if the GPZ was about efficiency, number 12 is about pure, unadulterated 80s excess. This is the Honda CX650 Turbo. The turbo wars of the early 80s were a brief, feverish period where all 4 Japanese manufacturers lost their minds and slapped turbochargers on mid-sized engines. Most were terrible, laggy, heavy, and complicated. But the CX650 Turbo was the one they actually got right. Honda learned from their earlier mistake, the CX500 Turbo, which was an overly complex science experiment that couldn't pull the skin off a pudding until the boost hit. For the 650, they bumped the compression, simplified the computerized fuel injection system, and tuned the turbo to spool up faster. The result was a 673 cubic centimeters twisted V-twin that made a factory-claimed 97 horsepower, liter bike power in a middleweight package. When you rode it, the experience was intoxicating. You'd roll on the throttle at 4,000 RPM and feel nothing. Then, a split second later, the gauge would light up, the turbo would whistle, and it felt like you'd been rear-ended by a semi-truck. It was violent, addictive acceleration. The fairing looked like it belonged on a spaceship, painted in pearl white with red and blue stripes that screamed USA despite being thoroughly Japanese. It was only sold in 1983, killed off by high insurance rates and a price tag that could buy a small house. It remains the absolute peak of the turbo era, a brilliant, complicated, fast machine that answered a question nobody asked. While some engineers were busy bolting turbos to everything, others were looking across the Atlantic at European sophistication, trying to build bikes that valued soul and industrial design over raw boost. We are moving away from the turbo madness and into a strange period where Japanese manufacturers became obsessed with Europe. They weren't just trying to beat the Italians and Germans on the racetrack. They wanted to beat them on the street with sophistication, industrial design, and touring capabilities that defied the typical UJM mold. At number 11, we have a machine that confused absolutely everyone when it launched, but today looks like a stroke of genius. This is the Yamaha XV920R. In the States, we knew the 15 engine as the heart of the Virago cruiser, a relaxed, chrome-laden V-twin. But Yamaha Europe had a different idea. They took that 920 cubic centimeters air-cooled V-twin and shoved it into a sport touring frame with aggressive ergonomics. The result was a torque monster that predated the Ducati Monster concept by over a decade. It was industrial, raw, and utilitarian in a way that Americans just didn't understand in 1981. The engineering quirks here are legendary. First, look at the drive chain. You can't see it. That's because it's fully enclosed in a lithium grease bath inside a magnesium casing. Yamaha was trying to solve the maintenance headache of chains before O-rings were standard, essentially trying to mimic the reliability of a shaft drive with the weight of a chain. Then there was the headlight, a massive 8-inch round Cyclops beam that looked like it came off a locomotive. And the dashboard? It was a floating pod with a liquid crystal display that looked like a calculator from a sci-fi movie. It was weird, it was tall, and it vibrated like a tractor, but it had soul. Today, custom builders hunt these down relentlessly, because if you strip off the 80s plastic, you have a beautiful, stressed member V-twin that looks incredible as a cafe racer. Coming in at number 10 is a bike that proves you can have your cake and eat it too, provided you don't mind being a little controversial. This is the Suzuki GS650G Katana. Now, purists will scream that this isn't a real Katana like the 1100 or the 1000. But that's exactly why it's on this list. The big Katanas were terrifying, uncomfortable rack stretchers designed by Hans Muth and Target Design in Germany to shock the world. The 650G was the bike you could actually live with. It took that same radical, sharp-edged styling, the tank that flows into the seat, the two-tone seat leather, the angular fairing, and wrapped it around a bomb-proof shaft drive middleweight. The brilliance of the 650G was that it was a sheep in wolf's clothing. It had a 673 cubic centimeters inline 4 that was smooth and torquey, paired with a shaft drive that required zero maintenance. It featured Suzuki's anti-dive forks, a very 80s piece of tech that used brake fluid pressure to stiffen the front suspension during hard stops. While the system was numb, it looked high-tech. You got the street cred of riding a Katana, one of the most iconic shapes in motorcycle history, but you didn't have to deal with chain lube or a riding position that folded you like a pretzel. It's the forgotten Katana, often available for a fraction of the price of its big brothers, yet it captures the 80s aesthetic perfectly. Before we move into the single digits, let's take a quick breather. We're talking about brilliant engineering today, but the 80s also gave us some absolute head-scratchers. Honorable mention for Wait What goes to the Yamaha Virago 535. Remember that one? It had a gas tank that wasn't a gas tank. The fuel was actually under the seat to lower the center of gravity, leaving a hollow metal shell up top just for looks. Brilliant for handling? Maybe. Brilliant for confusing new riders at the gas pump? Absolutely. But enough about fake tanks. Let's get back to real performance. At number 9, we have the bike that many journalists at the time called the best handling motorcycle in the world. This is the Honda VF500F Interceptor, affectionately known as the Mini-Scepter. While the big VF750S were eating their own camshafts and ruining Honda's reputation for reliability, the little 500 was out there embarrassing two-strokes on the track. This was the smallest of the V4s, a 498 cubic centimeters liquid-cooled gem that featured a square-tube steel frame painted to look like aluminum. The engine was a marvel of miniaturization. It was a 90-degree V4 with 4 valves per cylinder, shoving 66 horsepower through a 6-speed gearbox. Because the engine was so narrow and the crankshaft was so short, the bike could flick side to side faster than anything else with a license plate. The sound was pure magic, a low, growling drone at idle that turned into a banshee scream at its 12,000 RPM redline. It sounded like a half-scale Formula One car. The V4 curse of soft camshafts that plagued the 700s and 50s rarely affected the 500s because the valve train was lighter and stressed differently. It was a complex, expensive, high-maintenance race replica that Honda built just to prove they could. It remains one of the most rewarding riding experiences of the decade. Speaking of rewarding engines, let's move from the corners to the drag strip. We are now leaving the canyons and heading straight for the stoplight drag races. In the mid-80s, Americans wanted power, but they didn't necessarily want to hunch over a gas tank to get it. They wanted to sit upright, look mean, and absolutely destroy whatever pulled up next to them. We have the bike that defined the power cruiser segment before the VMAX stole all the glory. This is the Kawasaki ZL900 Eliminator. Just look at the name, Eliminator. It wasn't trying to be friendly. In 1985, if you wanted a cruiser, you usually got a detuned engine with more chrome than horsepower. Kawasaki looked at that formula and laughed. They took the liquid-cooled 16-valve inline-4 straight out of the legendary Ninja 900, the same engine that made the GPZ the fastest bike in the world, and dropped it into a low, long chassis. They swapped the chain for a shaft drive to handle the torque, slapped on a fat rear tire, and gave it a drag bar riding position. The brilliance of the Eliminator was that it was a total lie. It looked like a cruiser, but it rode like a sport bike. Let's do a quick stat attack to show you just how unfair this fight was. In 1985, the Harley-Davidson Sportster 883 made about 46 horsepower and ran the quarter mile in roughly 14.5 seconds. The Eliminator 900? It made 105 horsepower and smashed the quarter mile in 11.2 seconds. That is not a race. That is a bullying incident. It revved to 10,500 ERPM. When the light turned green, you could launch this thing hard enough to blur your vision, leaving Corvettes and Camaros wondering what just happened. It was only made for 2 years, 1985 and 1986, before being replaced by the 1000, but the 900 remains the purest expression of the concept. It's a ninja in a tuxedo, a sleeper that still catches people off guard today. Moving to number 7, we have the most technologically advanced couch ever built. This is the Yamaha Venture Royale. In 1983, Honda owned the touring market with the Goldwing. Yamaha wanted a piece of that pie, but they didn't just want to copy Honda, they wanted to out-tech them. So they built a massive V4 touring bike that was faster, smoother, and weirder than anything else on the road. The engine was a 1,198 cubic centimeters liquid-cooled V4. If that sounds familiar, it's because this is the grandfather of the VMAX engine. In the Venture, it was tuned for torque, but it still had that distinct V4 growl that made the Goldwing sound like a sewing machine by comparison. But the real 80s magic was the class system, computer leveling air suspension system. You had a control panel on the fairing where you could literally type in your suspension settings, and an onboard compressor would adjust the air shocks while you rode. It had a cassette deck, a CB radio, and a dashboard that looked like the cockpit of a 747. It handled surprisingly well for a 700-pound beast, thanks to the frame geometry, but it's largely forgotten because the Goldwing was just too dominant. If you find one today, you're getting VMAX DNA in a bike that costs less than a used scooter. At number 6, we have a motorcycle that was so good it became boring, and so reliable it became invisible. This is the Honda CBX750. No, not the 6-cylinder CBX from the late 70s that everyone collects. This is the inline-4 that replaced the CB750F in 1984. It is the forgotten middle child of Honda's lineup. The engineering here was quietly revolutionary. Honda was obsessed with reducing maintenance, so they gave the CBX 750 hydraulic valve lifters. That meant 0 valve adjustments, ever. For a high-performance inline-4 in the 80s, that was witchcraft. They also moved the alternator from the end of the crankshaft to behind the cylinders, making the engine incredibly narrow for better cornering clearance. It made 91 horsepower, handled beautifully, and never broke. So why is it forgotten? Because the V4 Interceptors came out around the same time and stole every headline. The Interceptors were the race bikes. The CBX was just the really good motorcycle. It didn't have a cool nickname, it didn't win superbike championships, but it was arguably the better street bike. The CBX750 was the peak of the more is more philosophy. But as the decade drew to a close, a counterculture was brewing, one that traded cylinders and plastic fairings for pure, minimalist riding joy. We are entering the top 5 now, and the theme is shifting. Before we dive in, I have a challenge for you. How many of you have actually seen one of these next 5 bikes in the wild? Because from here on out, we're getting into the machines that even the experts usually get wrong. Drop a comment if you've owned one, or take a guess right now at what number 1 is going to be. While the previous bikes were about pushing technology forward, turbos, anti-dive forks, computerized dashboards, this next group represents a fascinating counter-movement. In the late 80s, as bikes became faster, heavier, and more covered in plastic, a few manufacturers started looking backward to go forward. They realized that maybe, just maybe, riders missed the simplicity of the past. At number 5, we have the bike that tried to bring back the super single sport bike when nobody asked for it. This is the Yamaha SRX600. In 1986, if you walked into a dealership, you were surrounded by screaming inline-4s. And then, sitting in the corner, was this slender, beautiful machine with a big 600 cubic centimeter single-cylinder engine sticking out of a narrow steel frame. It was a masterpiece of minimalism. Yamaha took the engine from the XT600 Dual Sport, tuned it for the street, and geared it for torque. The brilliance of the SRX600 wasn't in its top speed, which was barely over 100 miles per hour. It was in the corners. The bike was incredibly narrow. It felt like you were riding a bicycle with a rocket strapped to it. It had high-end components like dual disc brakes up front and piggyback reservoir shocks in the rear. It was a canyon carver's dream, capable of embarrassing much larger bikes simply because it carried so much corner speed. But Yamaha made one fatal mistake that killed the bike in the US market instantly. They didn't give it an electric starter. In 1986, American riders had moved on. Kickstarting a high-compression 600 cubic centimeter single was a ritual, sure, but it was also a sweating, swearing nightmare if you stalled at a traffic light. Dealers couldn't give them away. Today, however, the SRX is a design icon. Prices are skyrocketing because we finally appreciate what Yamaha was trying to do: create a pure, unadulterated connection between the rider and the road. If the SRX was a nod to the past, number 4 was a full-blown love letter to it. This is the Honda GB500 Tourist Trophy. When Honda released this in 1989 and 1990, people were genuinely confused. It looked like a 1950s Norton Manx that had been time-traveled into a Honda showroom. It had clip-on handlebars, wire-spoke wheels, a solo seat cowl, and deep black-green paint with gold pinstriping. It was arguably the most beautiful motorcycle Honda ever produced. The specs were modest: a 498 cubic centimeters air-cooled single derived from the XBR 500, making about 33 horsepower. But the brilliance was the execution. Honda captured the feeling of a vintage British racer without the oil leaks or the Lucas, Prince of Darkness electrics. It handled telepathically, diving into turns with just a shift of your hips. But just like the SRX, it was a sales disaster. In 1989, riders wanted the CBR 600 Hurricane. They wanted neon graphics and full fairings. The GB500 sat in warehouses, unsold, for years. I've heard stories of dealers selling brand new ones in the mid-90s for half their MSRP just to get them off the floor. The irony, of course, is painful. Today, a clean GB500 will sell for over $10,000 on Bring a Trailer. Honda was absolutely right about the retro trend. They were just 20 years too early. At number 3, we have a motorcycle that is the complete opposite of the petite GB500. This is the Suzuki VX800. This bike is a weird, wonderful mashup that could only happen in the late 80s. It was designed in a US studio by a team that looked at the Suzuki Intruder Cruiser and thought, what if we put that engine in a sport touring frame? The result was a long, low, liquid-cooled 805 cubic centimeters V-twin with a shaft drive. It shouldn't have worked, but it was brilliant. The engine was a torque monster, pulling hard from idle with a unique syncopated exhaust note that sounded like nothing else on the road. Because the wheelbase was so long, it was incredibly stable on the highway, yet slim enough to split lanes effortlessly. It looked like a stretched-out naked bike, with a beautiful exposed frame and a clean, uncluttered look. It was reliable as a farm implement. That intruder engine is practically unkillable and comfortable enough to ride across the country. It failed because it didn't fit into a neat category. Was it a cruiser, a sport bike, a tourer? Buyers didn't know, so they ignored it. But for those who bought one, the VX800 remains one of the best all-around street motorcycles ever made. And that brings us to the final two, the absolute peak of why didn't you buy this? At number 2, we have the most significant engine of the decade wrapped in a bike everyone ignores. This is the Yamaha FZ750. In 1985, while Suzuki was obsessing over making frames lighter with the GSX-R, Yamaha was reinventing internal combustion. They introduced the Genesis concept: 5 valves per cylinder, 3 intake, 2 exhaust. It sounds like engineering overkill, but think of it this way. Trying to get air into a normal engine at high RPM is like trying to breathe through a cocktail straw while running a marathon. The 5-valve head was like breathing through a fire hose. It allowed for a steep 45-degree cylinder bank angle and a straight-shot downdraft intake that shoveled air into the engine like a furnace. The result was a 749 cubic centimeters inline-4 with massive linear torque and a screaming top end that felt electric. It was the future, hidden in plain sight. It was brilliant, but the GSX-ER 750 launched the same year and stole the spotlight because it looked like a race bike. The FZ was a sophisticated street weapon, and that 5-valve DNA powered Yamaha sport bikes like the R1 for the next 20 years. And finally, at number 1, the ultimate misunderstood masterpiece, the Honda NT650 Hawk GT. In 1988, Honda dumped this poor man's Ducati onto a market that didn't understand it. It was a naked 647 cubic centimeters V-twin with a massive aluminum frame and a single-sided swing arm licensed from Elf Racing in Europe. It predated the Ducati monster by years. It was expensive to build, expensive to buy, and slow in a straight line compared to a cheaper Hurricane 600. So naturally it flopped hard. But the handling? It was telepathic. It was a race-spec chassis with a soulful, unkillable engine. Today, it's a massive cult icon, proving that spec sheets don't measure joy. It is the perfect 80s motorcycle. Expensive tech, totally misunderstood at the time, and absolutely brilliant to ride. The 1980s weren't just about plastic fairings and neon graphics. These 17 bikes proved that manufacturers were willing to take massive risks on turbos, big singles, and strange engineering just to see what worked. If you see one of these for sale, buy it before the rest of the internet figures out what they are. Subscribe for more deep dives into motorcycle history.